Hello, hello, hello. Oh, okay, that's better. Yeah, nice.
Okay.
So should I habitually choose one? Is that the one that's by default set up or something?
Doesn't
Okay,
matter.
good. All right.
Whoever closed last time did the correct thing, which no one ever does, which is mute all the microphones.
Oh, okay.
Usually none of us do that.
Okay. Right. Do they sometimes like have a feedback party here in the middle of the night when nobody's
They
looking?
don't,
Or
and it never happens in the room, but every now and then on the stream they cancel each other out if they're
oh, no
all,
kidding, really?
if they're all unmuted. Yeah, so it like is one of those great things. It fails silently.
Oh, nice. Well, let's sit for a bit. So I'll talk you through some of this, and some of it will just be sitting. But so we're going to do first a kind of a floor to ceiling body scan, perhaps. So I'd say be mindful of the twist in your knee and hip joints. Right? So I think the thing that most relieves your knees is to exploit whatever twist you have in your hip joints, and actually kind of roll your the feeling is you kind of roll your hips out, right? And that you don't have to, if you just roll your hips out and then just let them relax, it settles your lower body posture a bit, and over time it makes your knees more comfortable, basically. Um, and then next, pay attention to the tilt in your pelvis. So if you roll your pelvis all the way forward, you'll notice a kind of crimp in your lower back. If you roll it all the way back, you get this sort of strange kind of experience in your posture that really makes it feel like you're going to collapse if you do it for too long, right? So just to find the sweet spot in between those two, where your stomach muscles and the muscles in your lower back are lightly engaged, but also mostly kind of relaxed, right? And you feel settled from your belly down, right? And then you can rock right and left. Notice where gravity grabs you, and find the spot right in between the places where gravity starts pulling on you. And that's functionally the center point, and similarly with forward and backwards. And when you find that spot, you sort of plant yourself there, and notice what that does to the large muscles in your that are sort of holding up your frame. They don't have to work very hard to hold you up if you're balanced, right? So find your hara. It's this place kind of a couple of inches below your navel and right in the middle of your body. And put your attention there. Don't do anything with it yet. Just put your attention there and imagine that there's a pillar standing in your hara that's slightly lifting your sternum, basically. So what that does is it lifts your chest a little bit, opens it maybe, and allows your shoulders to float back. That in turn softens the muscles in the middle of your back and allows them to feel like the flesh and the muscle in the middle and your upper back are kind of just falling down sort of towards your iliac region. Right? Up above that, your head can float off your shoulders like it's being lifted by some sort of anti-gravity device. If only we had an anti-gravity device. That allows your face to fall into a vertical plane without really having to tuck your chin too hard. Just let your chin fall and land on this platform of muscle that's around, runs around your jaw, basically. Allow it to rest there gently, not tucked too hard. And that'll put your nose kind of right above your navel and your ears in line with your shoulders. Let your head float back and up and maybe emphasize that the crown of your head is pointing directly at the ceiling. For hand posture, there's a number of things you can do, but try this if you like. Put your left palm on top of your right palm. Bend your hands around to a nice big circle, and then rest that against your lower abdomen so that you can feel the little fingers of both hands pressing gently against your lower abdomen and your thumb tips kind of right at the level of your navel. Everything else kind of hanging below. What this does also is that it sort of emphasizes your hara, right? That place we were talking about earlier. The joints in your arms, your shoulders, your elbows, wrists, and the joints in your hands should all feel relaxed and airy and full of energy, right? You sit with our eyes open and down. The gaze is soft and relaxed and also quite wide. It's good you don't have to open your eyes wide vertically, but it's good to be able to take in the whole periphery. So now we're going to talk a bit about the breath. This breathing is basically a soft version, a less athletic version of yogic Ujjayi breathing. So no. I need to change my focus. Because I set it to work focus because I was expecting a call, but now there we go. Sorry about that. So back to breathing. So to put your attention in your hara and also put a little bit of tension there. So you can sort of slightly grasp with your lower stomach muscles and the muscles of your pelvic floor so that you have this kind of, I don't know, it's like cantaloupe-sized sphere that in your lower abdomen that's holding that slight tension and focus, right? And with that, you just let your breath collapse out of the body and into the hara. I'll make a noise, but you don't have to make a noise, but it's something like, the collapsing can take either as long or as short as you like, but then when the breath is totally at the bottom of the cycle, there's a pause. And in that pause, there's very little happening. So just to let that happen. And then when your diaphragm says, breathe in, you let go any tension that you have, keep your focus there and just allow the breath to flood in and fill your body. And if you like, you can even imagine the in-breath climbing up the back, over the top of your head and landing here in the middle of your forehead. And then on the out-breath, the breath collapsing down the front of the body and into the hara. So you can do a sort of exaggerated version of that breath, 3 to 5 times if you like. And then after that, just let it take its own rate and depth, but still keep that focus. And maybe in a bit, I'll tell you what you can do with the pause. So at the bottom of your breath is this space, this pause. And what you can do there is say to yourself, silently, of course, what is it? And then just let the world answer. Let your body answer. Let your senses answer. Just take in what shows up when you ask that and let it register as completely as possible. And then again, when your breath says it's time to breathe in, just let it come in and let everything that was just building the world for you, let it all go. But in this moment, in this pause, the world is speaking to you. Your body is speaking to you. And with the in-breath, trust completely what happens next. why don't we stand up and walk a bit before we sit back down and do the rest of this here. This is walking meditation known as keening. And yes, you can spice it up by having a sip of tea. So I would say everybody turn left, and then on the next out breath, move your left foot forward a little bit, sort of in front of your right foot. And as you breathe out, allow your weight to transfer to that foot. And then on the in-breath, slowly lift your right foot onto the ball of your foot. Don't pick it up off the ground, just pick it up a little bit. And then on the next out-breath, plant that foot. And so it's essentially walking slowly in synchronization with your breath. And the rest of your posture from the waist up is just like Zazen. Upright, relaxed, energized. Doesn't matter how fast you go or how slow. What matters is to be deliberate and to really experience what it feels like to walk in this way, to feel the foot spread on the floor, to feel the shift of your weight. To feel the way the breath invites the step and the step invites the breath. All right, let's go back and sit down. So before we, go somewhere else, does anybody have any questions about any of that? And they can range from specifics of posture, what, in the either sitting or walking meditation. Also, what's it all for? Any of that? Any questions or comments? Even complaints are good. Great. Yeah, of course.
So you noticed us to draw attention to our hara,
Mm-hmm.
and I was noticing that like my inclination was to sort of like put my attention there, kind of like very much from here,
Mm-hmm.
and then I was like, oh, maybe I'm supposed to sort of like open and sort of like ambiently be aware, and then I was just wondering about what.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Like what exactly is it to keep your attention in your hara, and and at the same time, I mean, yeah. Nice, yeah, that's awesome. The and at the same time, yeah, you're the request is to be aware of the both sensate and sentient aspects of your entire experience, right? So in some ways, the way to think about it is your attention is in your hara in the sense that you're kind of watching everything from your hara. That's right. There's a focus on the hara, but surrounding that focus, there's the contents of your sensorium, there's your proprioceptive sense of your body, and there's the awareness of the flavor and texture and stuff that's going on in your mind, basically. Yeah, something like that. So I think your impulse to broaden your awareness in that way is correct, right? Does that make sense? Or
So it's like what I imagined when you said that. I imagined like opening an eye.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and you can allow your. I mean, I was talking about also this thing where you essentially allow your breath to climb your spine, land here, and then fall into your hara. You can that helps with keeping the sensation on the body as a whole, and also anchoring it here. And if the kind of deep focus on the hara is periodic with the breath, that's okay too. Like right when the breath falls all the way out, you could have your primary focus be in your hara, right? And see what happens there. Although typically when you do that, the quietness of that pause invites everything, right? Invites the feeling of your skin and the sounds in air conditioning unit, and so on and so forth, right? So yeah, it's like you're opening an eye in your heart. Yeah.
Can you describe what the hara is?
Yeah. So it's essentially the bottom of your breathing apparatus, right? And it's it's just this spot in the middle of your body, kind of a couple of inches below your navel, and you can, if the so do you ever do yoga?
Mhm.
Yeah. So I mean, the breath that we're talking about is really, it's a in yogic ujjayi breathing, there are these ideas of all these, there are these locks, right? So there's a throat lock, there's a lock in your pelvic floor, there's a lock here. Really, that what they're talking about is the same thing. Forget what the name of the lock is. Maybe it's Uddiyana Bandha or something like that. But anyway, it's a spot here where you can apply tension to the muscles surrounding it, and kind of hold a gentle tension there as you breathe, right? And if you go to East Asia and you go to pretty much any Buddhist temple, there are these guardian figures standing on either side of the gate, right? And one of them looks like this, and the other one looks like this. And what they're doing is they're doing this breathing, but they're doing a really exaggerated version of it. And that breathing is part of Japanese and Chinese and probably other Asian country martial arts practices. It's part of meditative sitting practice. It's obviously part of yoga and so on and so forth. It's really kind of a broadly attested practice. And what you discover if you do it in this really exaggerated way. So I had a workshop on this years and years and years ago. My teacher invited this guy who was a Rinzai Zen teacher and a kendo master to come and give a 2-week workshop on hara, basically. And which is, there's a sort of hara training program that people give in Japanese martial arts, but also, apparently office workers can get hara training. Right? And what I discovered was if you really do the breathing intensely, it has this effect where it really warms up your body, right? Like after half an hour of doing this stuff, you're like almost sweating, but certainly your body feels warm everywhere. And I took it at a time when I was still kind of playing in rock bands for a living. I was also working in a .com, and I was doing a lot of sitting, right? I was doing 7-day retreats and so on and so forth. And my shoulders and my hands were just totally weirded out, and I was getting like carpal tunnel-y things and all that sort of thing. I noticed that at the end of one of these workshops, all that stuff was gone. My muscles felt like, butter laying on top of butter, basically. So it's kind of good for you, right? And since then, I don't do it as intensely, but I kind of keep it as part of my regular sitting practice, and it's pretty beneficial, actually. So does that help? Or yeah. Well, good. Anything else? So I thought I'd talk about a Zen story. I won't quite tell the story yet, but the guy in this story is a guy named Dershan, who was lived in the Tang Dynasty in China, and he was in monasteries, I think, pretty early on in his life. But initially he was kind of in sort of scholarly practice, and he became an expert in this document, this very dense, complicated document called the Diamond Sutra, which is one of the sort of main documents of Mahayana Buddhism, which is the brand of Buddhism that spread most widely to China and then Japan, Korea, and Vietnam, and so on. And so he was an expert in the Diamond Sutra, and he lived kind of in the north of China. I'm not sure exactly where. And at one point, he heard about the Southern Buddhists and how they had these sort of what he thought of as completely heretical ideas about Buddhism, and he was determined to go down and have a debate with them and kind of show them what for, right? So he throws his commentaries on the Diamond Sutra in a big backpack, and he probably packed some power bars or something like that, and he started walking, and it was a long walk, like but anyway, so the first story about him is that he's walking along, and he's kind of landed in southern China now, and he's getting kind of close to his destination, and he walks into a little roadside tea stand, and there's this old woman in the tea stand, and he says, "Madam, I need some tea and cookies to refresh me." And I think the cookies were actually ginger snaps, interestingly enough. I don't know. And they're usually talked about as ginger cookies. And she says, "What's that backpack? What's in your backpack?" And he goes, "Hmm?" And she says, "What's in your backpack?" And he says, "Oh, I'm a Buddhist scholar. These are my commentaries on the Diamond Sutra." And the woman says, "Oh, well, it says in the Diamond Sutra that present mind is ungraspable, past mind is ungraspable, and future mind is ungraspable. What mind are you trying to refresh with your cookies and tea? If you can answer me, I'll give you cookies and tea for free. Otherwise, get out of my shop." and he was like, "Whoa." And so she booted him out. But she said, "You should go see this guy Lung Tan. He'll tell you what's up." And so he walks on a few, I think probably a few more days, and he arrives at this place. And Lung Tan means dragon pond, and so he arrives at Lung Tan's place, and he walks up and he says, "I've arrived at Lung Tan, but I don't see any dragon and I don't see any pond." And Lung Tan comes out and he goes, "Nonetheless, you've arrived at Lung Tan." So they sit down together and they start having this conversation, and they talk late into the night, and they're kind of debating Buddhist philosophy and so on and so forth. And he has this sense maybe he's not getting anywhere with it, but he's determined, and so on and so forth. And so finally he says, "It's really late. I got to go." And Lung Tan says, "Well, it's dark outside. Here, let me light a lantern for you." And he reaches down and he lights up one of these little tiny candle lanterns where there's a sliding, sort of sliding box. You can light it up. And he goes to hand it to him. And just as Dershan is grabbing the lantern, Lung Tan blows it out, and it's completely dark, right? And he has this moment where something happens in his mind. He's so surprised, and something kind of comes apart a little bit. And so he bows and he goes off and he goes to bed. And he wakes up in the morning, and he comes out in the middle of the courtyard at Lung Tan's place, and he lights a fire, and he takes one by one, he takes his commentaries on the Diamond Sutra out, and puts them in the fire and burns them up. And he says, "After this, I'm just going to go around and talk to people and see what's going on," basically. So he does, right? And okay, so that's the preamble, right? So here's the story. So Dushan goes off and he's wandering around, wearing out pair after pair of straw sandals and so on. And he finally comes to this place called Mount Kue or Kueshan. At this point, by the way, his name wasn't Dushan. He gets named Dushan later because he's named after the mountain that he sits on. But in any case, he comes to Kueshan, and so I'm going to tell you what happened, and what I want you to do is listen and see if anything comes up, see if you have any thoughts, see if you think it all seems like nonsense, whatever. And then afterwards, I'm going to ask you to each of you to say anything that jumped out. So, but anyway, so he walks onto the property, and there's a big lecture hall, and the teacher Kueshan is sitting in the lecture hall, and there's a bunch of monks around, and he walks in and he's carrying a pack, and he's got a staff, and he walks in and he just walks west to east across the hall, east to west, and he looks up and he goes, "There's no one here. It's nothing." And he turns around and walks out, right? And he storms down to the gate, and then he stops and he goes, maybe I shouldn't be so hasty. So he turns around, he walks back, and this time he walks in and he bows and he kind of does this really formal thing. And he acts like he's going to sit down. And what you do when you're a monk in robes is when you sit down, you pull out a mat. When you bow, you pull out a mat. It's in your sleeve, and you open it up like this. And he's just about to put it down, and Kueshan up in the head of the lecture hall, what he has to do is he has to pick up this whisk, and he has to bow. And so he reaches for his whisk, and Dushan yells really loud, "Rah!" And he folds his mat back up, turns around, pulls out his sleeves, and walks out. And he walks out, turns towards the gate, gets his shoes on, and takes a powder. And so later, Kueshan comes out and he asks the head monk, he says, "So where'd that guy go anyway?" He says, "Oh, he just walked off." And Kueshan says, "One day that lad is going to climb to the top of a mountain and build a grass hut, and he's going to just go on reviling the Buddhas and the patriarchs," right? And that's the end of the story. So what about that? Does anything come up for you? Does it just seem like total nonsense? What? Anything?
I've got nothing.
Excellent. What about you?
I'm curious why he ran out, I guess.
Yeah. It's a really good question. When you think about that, what do you so what you must know about these stories is that some of them might be true, but they're all fables that are intended to demonstrate something. So what do you think he might have been trying to demonstrate by storming off? Cool. Good answer. What about you? Anything?
I'm baffled.
Great. Excellent. Wonderful. So Zen Buddhism, it's a Mahayana Buddhist school. It grew up in during the Tang Dynasty in China and was sort of codified and turned into a literature in the Song Dynasty. So a couple of hundred years after, or maybe 150 or something like that, years after Dushan, right? And the way that literature was formulated, and maybe the way it was when Zen sort of started forming in the first place, was that it has this axiomatic framework, right? And the main clauses in the axiomatic framework are that teaching doesn't come from study and literature and stuff like that. The real wisdom and understanding, in the sense that's supported by Zen practice, arises essentially from relationships, right? Relationships between people and other beings, between people and things, right? It arises in the activities and commitments that are involved in those relationships, right? And then the other axiom is that Zen fosters and encourages that wisdom by pointing directly at the function of the mind, right? And that's a complicated sentence, because what that means is also pointing directly at the function of the body, because the mind and the body are pretty much entangled, right? And so that was established as a basis for practice, and people started going off to monasteries and studying that and meditating and famous monks and nuns gave talks and so on and so forth. And then later on, people started writing these things down, and then in the Song Dynasty, they were turned into these, into a literature, basically, with lists of these stories of the kind that we're talking about, and commentaries and poems that went along with them, and commentaries on the poems, and so by now it's a stack of books 15 feet high or something like that, right? Which is kind of ironic, but really, the entire intention of the literature is to have a bunch of demonstrations of what it means to have to have the Dharma and awakening arise in the relationships between people and things, right? And so the question is, how do you act when you're trying to help the people that you're interacting with wake up and stay awake and have minds that are flexible and full of energy and kind of spontaneity, right? And so if you look at Kwaishan and Dershan in that context, kind of they were being ridiculous, but at the same time, the main thing they didn't do was they didn't say any words to each other at all, right? They were just like, I'm going to do this gesture. Okay, I'm going to do this other gesture, right? And they kind of answered each other in this way where nobody had to actually say anything, and then they were done, right? That's Dershan walked out, and when Kwaishan found out that he'd left, he basically, saying that he's going to go, sit down in a grass hut and revile the Buddhas and the patriarchs, is a kind of backhanded compliment, right? The Kwaishan kind of thought he was pretty cool, right? So that's kind of what that story is about, right? The risk there, though, is that, and I think they even say this in the commentary on this case in the book that it's in, which is called the Blue Cliff Record. The difficulty with that is that people might assume that that's the standard of behavior. You've got to be, kind of abrupt and brash and all that sort of thing. And you can see that brashness and abruptness was part of Dershan's basic personality. I mean, one of the interesting things about this literature is that it makes a big deal about the actual personality of each of the personality and style of each of the sort of major teachers and kind of monks that make an appearance in the literature, right? They're like, if you look at a lot of other religious literatures, they don't really make a big deal out of the personality quirks and style of their protagonists, but the Zen literature really does, because the idea is that each one of us is different. We come to practice and we benefit from practice in different ways and each in our own way. And so if everybody had to act like Dershan and Kuei-shan, there'd be people would be throwing things and yelling and they'd never say anything at all, and that would be sort of bad. So there's a whole bunch of different ways to get at this, but still the fundamental request is to there's a whole thing in Buddhism about right speech, right? And there's a lot of rubrics around right speech, that the speech should be welcome and not self-interested and well considered and all the rest of that sort of thing. And all of that stuff is great, right? But the fundamental and essential aspect of right speech is, from a Buddhist perspective, is that it leaves all the people in the exchange feeling more awake, like there's more possibilities, and like the emotional quality of the exchange was enlivening and refreshing, right? That's the way, that's the standard of behavior that the koan literature and Zen in general kind of holds up, is to live a life and engage in behavior that has that quality as much as you can humanly manage it, right? And lest you think that's a minor ambition and not particularly useful, like in a different life, I've probably already talked about this, but I used to do international standards work for a living, and basically it was this perfect petri dish for just studying people, right? You get 1,000 people, they go to a hotel, I was doing 8 of these meetings a year, so every month and a half or so, go to a hotel in Shanghai or southern France or Schaumburg, Illinois, or Australia or whatever, right? Just all over the world. And they all sit down together. And these are people, they all the same people come to these meetings. So they all know each other really well. And they're working on some standard, and these were standards for wireless communication. But and they divide up into little groups, and they each work on different parts of the standard. And there's, in the standards bodies I was working with, there were a ton of these groups, 802.11, 802.15.4, and so on and so forth. And after a while, you start to see that some of the groups are great and they get a lot done, and everybody's all fired up, and they work together effectively. And some of the groups cannot do anything. Right? They just grind away and engage in parliamentary procedure and all the rest of that sort of thing, and nothing comes out. And after a while, some of the the guy that ran both of the major standards organizations that I was working with there was one group that was so bad that he started reading at the plenary meeting that opened the session nasty comments in the online exchanges about the standard, which is really super important, right? Like huge companies, comms companies in Asia, Europe, and the U.S. and elsewhere were hanging on this piece of the standard in order to build product, right? And so it was quite consequential. They were spending in the aggregate hundreds of millions of dollars on it, and they couldn't get anything done. And so he would read the nasty comments about them from the literature in order to try and motivate them to get some work done, and it didn't work. And finally, they just had to disband, and all these companies went and built their own thing that was not that didn't, where they couldn't interoperate and so on and so forth. So it was pretty consequential. And once you dig into it, what you realize is that here's how it works. Like these groups have maybe 20 or 30 people in them. Of those 20 or 30 people, maybe somewhere between 5 and 10 do all the talking, and of those 5 and 10 people, maybe 3 or 4 people do all the actual work. They do the editing and the document writing and all the rest of that sort of thing. And if those 3 or 4 people can't look each other in the eye and feel comfortable having an idea, right? In other words, if the emotional quality of their relationship isn't sufficient and the trust between them isn't sufficient that they can meet mind to mind, then they don't get any work done. And then their bosses spend hundreds of millions of dollars for nothing, right? So there's an application of Buddhism for you, right? And it was just as obvious as the day is long how it was working. And you don't have to believe me. There's been a bunch of work on how teams work and how they get how they operate efficiently or effectively, and how they are ruined. And most of it has to do with things like emotional quality and trust, right? So anyway, so that's pretty much all I had to say about it. Any questions about that? So again, what if you were Joshan and you were walking around China trying to get educated, what would you do? Well, that's a good answer. Let's sit for a few more minutes and then call it a night. Thank you a lot. Thank you so much for coming. So do you have any announcements or anything to make?
I have announcements. Yeah, there's a bunch of interesting stuff going on this weekend. Saturday, we have Bex and Elena doing a somatic movement workshop that